Welcome to the Distinguished Physical Education Podcast. This is Gary Zaharatos. Before introducing my guest today, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has helped us achieve 5,000 downloads. It's really inspiring to discover that so many physical education teachers out there find value in these conversations around classroom management strategies, impactful instructional methods, and overall best practices in our content area. I hope that you'll continue learning alongside me and my guests, sharing episodes with your colleagues, and reflecting on your practice. Just a reminder that the first offering of the Distinguished Physical Education online book study will be offered at some point soon. The course is ideal for physical educators seeking professional growth, collaboration with peers, and new ideas to refine their instructional methods. By the end of the book study, participants will be equipped with new strategies and inspired to implement meaningful change in their classrooms and gyms. Don't miss this opportunity to grow alongside fellow educators and earn hours toward your teaching license renewal. We already have a few districts that we are going to be facilitating the course for. If you or your school district is interested in more information, please fill out the Google form linked in the notes. My guest today is Erin Evans. Erin is a passionate physical education teacher originally from Australia. Erin's journey brought her to Montana, where she played soccer at Rocky Mountain College and earned her Bachelor of Science in Health Enhancement K-12. Since starting her teaching career in 2014, Erin has been dedicated to promoting health and wellness not only in her physical education classes, but also throughout her community. Erin has made a lasting impact in her community by serving on the PTA board, organizing annual fun runs, raising funds for a new playground, and running a thriving after-school program called PEAK, providing enhanced activities for kids that engages students across 18 elementary schools in her district. Her commitment to excellence was recognized when she was named Shape Montana Teacher of the Year in 2024 and Western District Teacher of the Year in 2025. I've reached out to several of the recent award winners and hope to have many of them on the podcast in the coming months. If you are interested in being a guest on the show, please fill out the Google form in the show notes or email me at gary@distinguishedpe.com. Erin and I discussed the varying expectations for what a high-quality physical education program looks like in different districts and states, curriculum, heart rate monitors, the benefits and challenges of providing students with opportunities to self-assess their progress toward goals, various ways to reflect on your own practice as a teacher, the role that being a reflective teacher with a growth mindset plays in avoiding teacher burnout, and other topics. And now I bring you Erin Evans. Erin, thanks for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here, Gary. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Before we get started, I wanted to congratulate you on your recent awards. How does it feel?
Thank you very much. Oh, it feels great. Definitely fills my bucket, that's for sure.
That's awesome. I'm sure that your school and your community are proud of you. One of the things that I've been meaning to talk more about in these conversations that I'm having with PE teachers are how best practices are defined in PE in various cities and school districts and states. We have some pretty unique expectations here in Denver for all of our teachers, including our specials teachers, PE, art, music. I'd love to talk about how we define quality physical education programs in various places. In Denver, we have some pretty unique expectations. They're based off of a federal consent decree, which essentially guides teachers' efforts with the language skills that students need so that all students have the language supports that they need in order to meaningfully and equitably engage in school. So, for example, in a PE class in Denver, in order for us to be considered a high quality, effective PE program, not only do we need to have students demonstrate something physically or make progress towards demonstrating something physically, we also need them to be able to use language to articulate their learning. Do you have any types of requirements like that in Montana?
We don't, not in my district at least. We have our standards that we can hit. Our standards, unfortunately, we were able to kind of create our own. So we've looked at aligning them with the national standards, but then taken those national standards and kind of created them as our own. But in regards to, checking out with a kid and having them being able to articulate how they did what they did today definitely happens more on the individual basis as a teacher. Definitely not something that has been required. We definitely post I can statements. So I guess that would be a way that we would do that. So for instance, today we're working on throwing skills and striking skills this week. And so my kindergarten and first grade students should be able to say, I can show body positioning when throwing a ball. I can show overhand throwing to a target. So I think that would be the best way for best practices, but they don't articulate it to us. We talk about what our expectations are, and this is where our focus is today. But with the younger kids, they don't necessarily come back and say, hey, I did that, unless there's a conversation with a kid. It's not a checkout with them.
I think that's awfully similar to our expectations. Okay. And maybe we're just like slightly more intentional about it. So for example, in using your lesson, if we were to have a PE teacher aligned to, we have a framework for effective teaching. It's called LEAP, and it defines what best practices are in Denver. So if we were to have a teacher aligned to the effective performance category on that rubric, for example, thinking about your lesson about throwing, all we would do really is do two things, I think. We would tweak it so that students were using a specific type of language, and I'm thinking of a couple, and teachers just choose whichever one fits the best, right? So one could be that students are going to sequence how they do an overhand throw. In that case, they're going to use words like, first, I point at my target. Second, I step with my opposite foot. Third, I hold the ball by my ear. And then finally, I throw and follow through. They could also describe the cues of how to do an overhand or an underhand throw. We're going to talk a little bit later about self-assessment. They could use like analyzing language to self-assess on the overhand throw. And then the other part would just be opportunities throughout the lesson, usually like 2 or 3, and they can be teacher to student, or they could be students to their peers using that language at various points throughout the lesson. So oftentimes what I see are teachers who will start off with like a turn and talk in the beginning of the lesson, where students are going to start to sequence or describe or self-assess or whatever. In the middle of the lesson, the teacher might just go around and check in individually with students as they're engaging in the lesson. The teacher might say, hey, can you show me what the first thing you do is when you throw a ball overhand? Oh, could you tell me what the next thing is? And then the student would use language. And then there's usually like one opportunity at the end. So it's kind of like bookend with the language opportunities, maybe one in the middle. And then of course, lots of opportunities throughout for students to make progress physically as well.
I was just thinking that when you were saying the student sharing, what you're explaining is everything that I definitely do in my class. I just think I've never really thought of it as being classified as a best practice, and it's just been what I do. That's just how we teach. And so we were doing basketball today and some dribble knockout in my 4th graders. And I asked them to share something that their partner did positive today. And then I asked them to say something that they may need to work on as well, but giving them a good like a reason why, like that good criticism. And so I think definitely those best practices are fluid across Denver to Billings then. But I think when we're not necessarily quote unquote expected to do that, when we get evaluated from our admins, they just have like a little check sheet, right? And this is more in the elementary realm of things, and we're very individualized. It's just us at the one school. So we don't really get to collaborate with other PE teachers within our school. So being as though those best practices, we're doing them. We're not necessarily expected for it.
Yeah, I had a feeling that you were doing something similar to the expectations that we have here. I'm just always so curious what teachers are expected to do in other districts or other cities. I wonder, and I think it's true, there's probably PE programs out there where students can essentially not have to speak the entire lesson and just demonstrate something. There's no like expectation for an accountable talk opportunity in order for students to articulate their learning. They just do a physical skill.
Yep.
I mean,
I would agree with you.
I know that, I learned this when I got to Denver because that's what the expectations for all teachers are, but it really does kind of mesh with my philosophy. I can't really imagine going back to a PE program where students are expected to like just be quiet the entire time and just make progress towards a physical skill. It's so important for students to be able to, at the end of class, advocate for the PE program in a sense by telling their classroom teacher, telling a building leader, telling a parent what they walked away with from PE, like what they learned in class today, and not just that they played in a game.
Yeah. The game, yeah.
Yeah, not just the game. I think that's the overarching goal. So some people might think, oh, well, that's a little bit crazy. Like I have to have my students do accountable talk structures in PE class. At the end of the lesson, though, when a student's able to respond to the question, what did you learn in PE today? And they can say, oh, well, I learned how to do the overhand throw, and I can tell you what comes first and second and last. That's pretty impressive, as opposed to, oh, we played a throwing game in PE today. And the teacher or the principal is just like, oh, okay, that's great.
Exactly. Being more intentional with our teaching and with our conversations with our kids is important. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about those veteran teachers later on in this discussion today. And I think having those intentional conversations is not on their agenda to have with those kids. That's probably the teachers that have their kids come in, they play their game, and then out they go type thing. And so I know we're going to touch base on that a little bit later, but that would be interesting to see if that could be a change for them.
Yeah, totally. The things that we're talking about really weren't the expectations for PE 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's going to be new to a lot of folks. And yeah, we'll talk about how some teachers reflect on, updating their practices or choosing not to, I guess. Before we move on to our second topic about student self-assessment, which I know you're very passionate about, I wanted to ask you just about what resources or curriculum that you might use in Billings. Does your district recommend any type of curricular resource?
We have the Montana OPI, and we do have kind of similar to like your Shape America standards. We have Montana ones as well, along with are they reaching their grade level outcomes as well in there. In regards to the resources that they would provide us, we've really taken it and created it for what works in our district. And so we have a little curriculum team of about 4 or 5 people. And we sat down and we kind of essentially we planned a whole year out. And so whenever a new teacher comes in, we can essentially give them this guide and then they can sort of follow along. Our pacing guide is so much more detailed and structured compared to what we actually grade on. Unfortunately, we only grade on 3 standards per grade level. I would love to see that change, but at the same time, then teachers are going to tell me, why am I doing more? Unfortunately. So when I think about that, I know our pacing guide is definitely our resource that we share. Yeah, I think we've gone through them. We've gone over them numerous years. I think we're probably due for another revamp. I know I've definitely got that passion behind me to go ahead and look at comparing, contrasting from other districts as well across the United States and saying, hey, why are we not up to here? We're not on par right now. We should be. We're the largest district here in Montana, and we're not doing what we need to be doing. So,
is it a requirement that teachers use this curriculum? Are you expecting each teacher to follow the scope and sequence throughout the course of the year, or is it more of a resource? Hey, you could plan your own lessons if you want, but we really do have this incredible standards-based curriculum that you could use if you want to.
So in the physical education realm of our job, so we do health and physical education. So in that side of things, we ask that our teachers within elementary school is about 2 weeks from each other. So hoping then that, if I'm right now working on throwing and striking, that hopefully within 2 weeks, give or take, across the board, other people are also doing the same thing, or they're right on par with where I am too. And that's just because we have a lot of kids that will move and transfer. And so students have to go to their neighborhood schools here in Billings. I'm not sure if that's the same in Denver or if they can kind of pick and choose. But yeah, if you live in a certain area, then you are required to go to that school. And sometimes kids move. And so to keep kids consistently learning and not necessarily going back and be like, oh, Miss Evans, we've already done this. I did this in my old school for 5 weeks and I don't want to have to do it again. So we ask that they are within a couple of weeks with each other. But again, requirement, are you going to lose your job over it? No. Are you going to make others probably disappointed that you're not just doing what we need to do? Absolutely. So,
Makes sense to me. I know that there's a handful of districts out there who have a pretty rigid curriculum and they expect their teachers at 9:30 on February 1st to be teaching this particular moment of a lesson. So that always seemed a little bit too much for me. I really like your approach though with give or take 2 weeks. That means that the normal things can happen, whether it's classes going on field trips or teachers needing to reset lessons due to behavior issues and they might lose a lesson or two here and there and they didn't get to the content that they wanted for that day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think flexibility is huge in teaching.
All right, I'd love to talk about a topic that I know is of major interest to you, which is providing students with opportunities to self-assess their progress. What inspired you to incorporate self-assessment into your physical education classes, and how did you get started with it?
Yeah, so I wanted to be more intentional this year as well, and last year with one of our standards. And one of our standards here in Billings is that a student is participating at moderate to vigorous activity. And I was like, well, how on earth am I going to be able to say, yes, this kid is doing better than Jane over there, or that Jane and Doug are doing the exact same? And so my biggest thing here in fourth grade and fifth grade, about 4 or 5 years ago, I incorporated heart rate monitors. And I was like, again, Jane over here is doing one thing and Doug's doing the same thing over here. But how do I figure out if they are actually moving their body and exerting the energy to be moderate to vigorous? And I was like, okay, heart rate. We learn it in fourth grade and fifth grade in health. And what a good way to then take learning in health in the classroom and bringing it into PE. And these kids, they absolutely loved wearing these heart rate monitors. They had their name was up on the board and they had a color code to if they were like exerting, 90% of their heart rate or whatever the case is. And I got the best feedback from those kids because I would have thought Jane over here was not giving me any effort because she wasn't red-faced and sweaty. And then when I looked at her data on the Polar app, oh my goodness, like she was up there the whole entire time. But just because she didn't look like she was exerting the energy, like it just gave me confidence in being able to give her a proficient grade because she showed me through this heart rate monitor that she has exerted that much energy. And so that's where I go with my fourth and fifth graders is I use the heart rate monitors. And again, it's been a great reflection even for me to know like, okay, my bowling unit is not probably going to get there, but I am going to get them up there in their warm-up. So I know now looking forward that I still want them up there, that vigorous or that moderate at least, even in our slower units. Or if we have like a basketball unit, I know they're going to get up there during that content. So maybe we do a little easier of a warm-up, just so we're not always up at high. So I do that with fourth and fifth. And then this year I was like, okay, how am I going to be more effective with my younger kids? And so I chose second and third grade just because they can be a little bit more independent. And I asked them the same question. I asked them like, are you moderate to vigorous activity for the 30 minutes in PE? And I give them a thumbs up, a thumbs across the middle, or a thumbs down. And then I color code that green, yellow, and red. And so I'm not sure if you've ever heard of plickers before, but a plicker card is what I use. So then I can scan and I collect data on the kids again. I don't have the kids' names on them, so it's not specific to them. So if they actually thought they were bad that day and they didn't perform, it's not kind of singling them out because they each have a unique number. And I think that's important that we're not necessarily singling those kids out, but it's a good reflection for me to see where those kids are placing themselves. Like, hey, my performance today was probably just mediocre. I could have given Miss Evans a little bit more. Or, you know what, today I just wasn't feeling it, Miss Evans. I gave myself a red because, you know what, this game wasn't for me. This was boring. And it's a good reflection back to me as a teacher. So I do a self-reflection for grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm trying to figure out how to do it with my kindergarten and first graders. That one's going to be a little bit tricky.
When I see teachers implement opportunities for student self-assessment here in Denver, I certainly see them use heart rate monitors and do exactly what you just talked about. The other part is actually going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier with those very clear and concise daily objectives that include that language component. So some teachers will have a language objective that says that students are going to self-assess their progress towards a certain skill. You made me think of it when you brought up bowling, because in bowling, students aren't going to self-assess on their exertion rate, right?
Yep.
So what we would expect in that lesson, and what I often see students do, is they're able to articulate a strength that they have in any particular skill. And then they're also able to articulate what a next step is that they're currently working on. And that would be what self-assessment looks like. You could also align various rubrics to that. So for upper elementary or middle or high school kids, you could give them a rubric so that they might say, I'm aligning myself to a 3 on this 4-point rubric. One of my strengths is blank, and the thing that I'm working on is blank. What I see for K2, since you mentioned that earlier, in these situations is they'll usually just focus on one thing at a time. So they'll have to
Yeah.
tell the teacher one thing that they're really good at. And we consider that like self-assessment for K1, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So if you were bowling, a student might say, one thing that I'm really good at is that I always step with my opposite foot, right? Or just pick one of your favorite bowling cues, and you would hope that a student would be able to articulate something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could probably implement that. I have conversations with kids all the time. We reiterate the sequence of how to do something. And if they're able to sequence it back to me, then I know something's clicking. Yeah, I like that. That's more of a good reflection on the teacher part there as well. So it's not just self-reflecting for my students, but if my students are able to reflect and be positive and know what our focus is and I am able to do this, that's giving me the feedback that I am doing my job correct and teaching them the right way to do a certain skill. So
Yeah, absolutely. You can use that data that you collect, right? Just those verbal responses from students to know if you need to make any adjustments during the lesson. So, for example, most PE teachers are very comfortable with visual assessment, right? We can scan the room and we might go up to individual students and correct their form, or we might pause the whole class and say, hey, I noticed, that 6 students were still having trouble stepping with their opposite foot when they were bowling. Let me just do a quick reminder of what that looks like, what your opposite foot is, and so on.
Yeah.
That's great for the physical part. What this questioning and requiring students to use language does is it also gives you that opportunity to say, you know what, my students aren't actually able to use the word opposite foot. Some students don't really know what that word means. And they're really not able to say a strength, like something that they're really good at. So let me do a quick pause and remind students, hey, our objective today is to be able to communicate one thing that you're really good at. So if it's kindergarten, I would probably do like a choral response, like everybody say one thing I'm really good at, and then the whole class would repeat after you. So just a way to get everybody back on board with what the expectations are, both the physical expectation and the language expectation, students' ability to articulate what they're learning for the day.
I like it.
Can you share with us how you introduce the concept of self-assessment to your elementary students? At one point, this was something that was brand new to them. How do you communicate that to them, and how well received is it?
I don't introduce it at the very beginning of the year. I wait until we reach our heart rate unit in health, and we actually start taking our pulse in health in 4th and 5th grade. And so we usually do that about a month and a half into school. And then we get to talk about, what's happening to my pulse while I'm exercising. Oh, well, my pulse is going up. And so then after we're done talking about that, we then use the heart rate monitors and we use them in our health class before we put them on in PE. Now, even though my 4th graders did it and then they become 5th graders, I still wait until we talk about heart rate because there's been summer break. And I just like to be able to reiterate, this is the why behind it so that we can see what is happening when I am moving my body. And it's kind of that relationship that they're saying, oh, my heart rate is here. And that makes sense because I'm feeling this. And so they can make that relationship within themselves and with what they're seeing. It's like that immediate feedback.
That's such a great point, the timing and where it falls in the sequence of your lessons. For your example, right, you obviously want to teach them those health concepts before they put the heart rate monitors on so they understand what they're assessing on. The example that I gave with like a strength and a growth and students being able to articulate that, to me that sounds more like a middle or end of unit objective that you might have. You're probably not going to start out the first day of any given unit, but like the first day of a bowling unit, asking students what's something that they're really good at when they don't even really know what the cues are to being able to bowl, right? So where you put self-assessment in the sequence of your units or the sequence of your year-long plan, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. The 2nd and 3rd grade students, I told them, I said, Miss Evans has a lot of kids. I have a lot of kids that I need to be watching. And I said, I need your help. And so I make them kind of be like the boss of themselves. And so I said, you get to evaluate yourself. You get to tell me if you were great today when you were giving me the exercises or when you were giving me your performance. Or again, were you like mediocre? Or do you think, Miss Evans, I wasn't feeling it today? And so I have them talk to me and I let them know that I get to give them a grade. And sometimes they might not agree with that. And so this is their voice in PE. to be able to say, Miss Evans, I tried. You might not have seen it today, but I tried. I have a class of 30 in here, and I know you might not have seen me today. So I know I'm going to give myself green because you're going to see that next. And you're going to know then that I really did try for you today. And so giving them that voice and that kind of, job for themselves at the end, they look forward to it every time. I forgot to mention it today in PE, and they're like, Miss Evans, are we changing our square? And I was like, absolutely, go for it. They remind me to go and change their square over.
That's funny. I mean, you've obviously made it a part of the routine of everyday class, so students know what to expect. They've begun to internalize these expectations. One of the other benefits to self-assessment is the fact that students have buy-in, right? I mean, look at how excited they are, like you just mentioned, to get involved with the heart rate monitors and to check their progress. So students really have, a great deal of buy-in, and you're creating a culture where students have a voice in your PE class. Yeah. There have to be some challenges to implementing self-assessment. What are some challenges, and maybe what are some solutions that you could share with folks?
Yeah, so kids like to lie. But first of all, kids like to be super honest as well. So I definitely have a good mix of kids that I know somebody was maybe just standing there during like one of our games, and they're like trying to hide behind someone else or do whatever, and they still give themselves green. I have told them that even if they feel like they were at green, I said, Miss Evans still might have seen something a little bit different. And I just reiterate that every kind of 3 weeks or so, just a reminder that I'm also watching, and that I really want them to be honest with themselves too, because if, we can't be honest with ourselves, and people are going to see that as well. And that's not going to be okay. That's not a good thing to internalize. I had a funny story too, when I had first implemented this in my, he was a second grade boy. And for the first 3 weeks, this kid was just putting it at red. And I was like, okay, first week I let it go, and I kind of made sure I watched him a little bit more the second week. Nope, still red. And I was like, wow. All right, I'm going to make sure I touch base with him, let it go. One more week, third week, he's got red again. And I asked this teacher, I said, this boy, he keeps giving me red. I said, can I just have a quick question with him? And she's like, let me come over and talk to him too. And so we both asked him, when we had him show us across the board. We're like, hey, buddy, we noticed that you keep giving us red on your performance. Are you giving energy when you're playing in these games? Or are you kind of just being like a bump on a log, so to say? And he goes, well, red's my favorite color, though. And I was like, oh, my gosh. This kid was just like, he just wanted to keep showing red. He didn't really make the relationship that red was not giving me the best energy or best performance that he could. Yeah. And so now moving forward, I think I've seen him pretty much either in green or yellow. He has not yet turned that back to red after we made that connection of this was the reason why we're using red, green, and yellow. Let's reevaluate and reassess ourselves here. Did you participate today? Well, yeah. Did you participate with close to 100%? Yeah. Okay, then that means green. And so that was really funny with him too.
That's great. And that just goes back to having super clear expectations, reminding students of them over and over again. I mean, if somebody's going to try student self-assessment, we wouldn't want them to get discouraged early on in the process because students were confused about it, right? It's just like every other expectation that you have in your gym or classroom. If you want students to enter the gym a certain way or go get equipment a certain way, you don't just tell them one time and expect them to go do it. You explicitly teach them what the rules are, you hold them accountable to it, you make them practice over and over again. So self-assessment is just like any of those other expectations or transitions in a normal PE class.
Yep, absolutely.
Speaking of teachers who might want to implement student self-assessment into their practice, where might you have them start? Some people might think it's interesting, but they just might be unsure of exactly where to begin. We already talked about where in the year or where in a unit they might want to start to implement these things. What other advice might you have?
Yeah, so I think I would just tell them to start small. Maybe go ahead and start at 1 grade level and see if you can handle it. Maybe you do a trimester or you have semesters, and maybe you increase after that second semester or increase after that first semester to maybe adding a 2nd grade, or maybe you're just using it per class. I think that's really huge. I know now after our talk today, I need to probably focus a little bit more on myself for my self-assessment for kids into articulating it back to me what they're doing. And I'm keeping with just my standards that I'm grading on. But Definitely starting small is definitely huge there. If you try to do them all at once, you're going to be overwhelmed, you're going to be stressed out, and you're not going to be intentional with what you're trying to portray with your kids too. So pick your favorite grade and then go from there essentially.
Pick a class that might be ready for you to experiment with some ideas around self-assessment, and then start out small. Maybe, like I mentioned earlier, the first day is just about a strength. Let's just think about things that we're doing really well, and then we can implement some of those other practices a little bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And then share what you're doing with your classroom teachers, I think is huge as well. When they come to us, they share with us what's going on in their classroom. So share back with them what we've been doing in our class. Hey, this is what we're working on today, and maybe being more effective with that communication with classroom teachers as well. I think that would be another place to start. Hey, I'm planning on incorporating this. Can I come and speak to your kids before class just to kind of prepare them for what we're going to do in PE?
That's such a great idea, because self-assessment is a skill that's transferable to so many other real-world contexts. I also think it's pretty impressive. A classroom teacher would think, oh my gosh, they're going to be working on self-assessment in PE today. Like, that's incredible, right? They probably do some sort of self-assessment in their classroom as well. So these are skills that students should be somewhat familiar with. I think that would be a piece of advice that I would give PE teachers who are looking to start to implement student self-assessment. Go ask classroom teachers if they're already doing that in the classroom and what it looks like, because you might be able to borrow some of those structures and just modify them to make them look, appropriate for use in the gym. Then you wouldn't be starting from scratch. You would be starting with a structure that students are already somewhat familiar with.
Exactly. You're not reinventing the wheel there and then putting more pressure on these kids to know, okay, if I'm in my classroom, this is how it's done. Or if I'm in my PE classroom, this is what it should look like. So finding that common ground for kids is going to help a 7-year-old out. Exactly.
I say the same things with behavior expectations. Sometimes when a class is super challenging, one of the secrets is that the PE teacher and the classroom teacher just need to communicate with each other, because a classroom teacher might say, so when I have students sit on their carpet squares and I tell them to be at a voice level 0, sitting on their square and have their eyes on me, I get almost every student following those expectations. And the PE teacher will say, when I tell them to come in and sit on the 3-point line, they're disruptive. Things are crazy. I can't get them to be at a voice level 0. What the answer could potentially be is for the PE teacher to set up what would essentially look like carpet rows in the gym, so that students, if they sit in the blue row in their classroom, they can sit in the blue row in PE class, and they start to make that connection that PE is a class and has expectations just like my, general ed classroom does. So a lot of times it's just trying to make things look similar, even though they're going to have to be modified to be a little bit different in the gym. Student self-assessment is a topic that interests both of us, but we have another thing in common. We both value when teachers reflect on their own practice. So a large part of my job as an instructional coach over the last 10 years is to work with teachers to have them reflect on their practice and to continue growing and getting better for their students. What are some ways that you personally reflect on your teaching practice, and what tools or strategies have been most effective for you in identifying areas of strength and growth?
I think personally, for myself to reflect on my teaching, it would be just by obviously assessing my students. You had mentioned before that us as PE teachers, we definitely do that visual assessment really well. And I can sort of pick up within the first couple of minutes of us either playing a game or learning a skill if we're getting it or not. If we're not, then I know I'm going to have to go back and reteach. And that may be like, oh, everybody hands on top, and they respond back, everybody, that means stop. And I'll send to hug their bull or something like that. So for instance, today, my lesson, we were throwing. And so I always like to spotlight some students throughout the lesson as well. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love how Johnny was throwing today. Johnny, could you go ahead and can you demonstrate that again for our class? I noticed a few of our friends were having a hard time. Do you mind demonstrating that for us again? And so when I have a student demonstrate, I demonstrate. They're seeing both an adult demonstrating and modeling it. They're seeing a friend and a peer modeling it. And then usually we could then go through it together after we get back to practicing, and I can go through and help them again. Do you remember how Johnny was stepping with his left foot and he had that ball in his right hand? That's his opposite side. Oh, okay. And so I guess making those connections in that sense helps me reflect on, am I doing this right? And am I saying it right? Am I showing it right? Do I need to throw left-handed also because I asked the kids to put it in their right hand and I'm facing them and then they're putting it in their left hand? So, I think about when I was a fitness instructor and my right was the left that I would say, and my left is my right. So that tends to happen as well. So there's just little things that you pick up on when a kid is not necessarily visually assessing, right? And you're not seeing what you want to see. You need to go back and maybe re-explain or have a friend help explain it too. And then something else that I've been doing going into being nominated and a candidate for the National Teacher of the Year is filming. I filmed myself in the past, every now and again, I'll throw a camera up there and just kind of watch how I'm doing it. I don't necessarily sit there and listen to what I'm saying, but I've been a little bit more intentional these last 3 weeks and have noticed that, maybe I'm not reaching every student, or I'm constantly saying boys and girls or friends, or I have to ask somebody to stop more than 2 or 3 times. And so that reflection has been really good for myself personally, to be able to sit back and be like, oh, that sucked. What are you doing? Why did you say that? What did you do? And I sit there and I shake my head. And so then the next time I do that same lesson, I'm not going to do that again. I had them throwing against the wall, but I didn't put poly spots down. And oh my gosh, I had a mess. And I was like, nope. Why did I not put spots down for the kids to stand on and then go ahead and shoot at a target? Because that was like herding cats. And that was second grade. I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? So any kind of self-reflecting for us as a whole is huge. And we're able to make mistakes. We show kids that we make mistakes and then learning from them there. So yeah, definitely try and film yourself whenever you can, or even have a friend come in and just, hey, will you just watch me for a quick 10 minutes? Make sure that I'm, doing what I should be doing, or, what do you think I should be better on? Asking for feedback from other colleagues too is huge.
Those are 2 great examples of a real-time reflection. So getting feedback from your students in real time and then making an adjustment during a lesson. And then the other example was, after a lesson is over, going back and rewatching the film and making some adjustments for next time. There are some teachers who might not be as reflective as you. And I guess there's 2 things that I'd like to ask you. One is, what are some of the benefits of you being so reflective? Like, how does that show up in your practice or even just in your daily life? And then the other question is, what do you think are some common reasons that teachers might resist change or new ideas, or not be as willing as you to reflect on their teaching?
Let's think. So intentional, right? The reason why we teach and the reason why we teach PE is to instill our kids with good learning habits moving forward into life, right? We want them to know that whatever we're doing with our body now is going to affect us later on. And so I think doing the self-reflection continuously within ourselves is going to benefit me, because if I know I'm not hitting the mark with my students, then they're not going to get it for future. And I mean, sure, there are only 6 to 12-year-old kids that I'm working with daily, but, if I can instill that fun aspect as well in PE, they're going to hopefully continue to enjoy it. It's not going to be like, oh, we had to do push-ups because we're in trouble, or, they're not going to have that, oh, my PE teacher was a grump, or, I hate that when kids come in and tell me my PE teacher was so mean. And I'm like, why? That makes me sad. Like, we should be happy we get to play with our kids every single day, and we get to learn and grow and move with them. And so the benefit, I think, of that teaching reflection of myself just allows me to be better to give more to my kids. And then you said the next question was about if other teachers are resistant, correct? So I think then that goes to those veteran teachers, this is how they've done it. This is what works. Why change it, type of a thing. And, kids these days are not the same as they were 10 years ago. Parenting these days aren't the same. And that can be a completely different topic there. But, those kids are with us for 8 hours of the day. And if we aren't molding and growing with these students coming through our school, it's going to be very difficult for them.
I'm really lucky in Denver to work with so many teachers who are willing to reflect and grow in their practice. It's pretty rare these days where I end up working with a teacher who just isn't really interested in engaging like in a coaching cycle, right? Engaging in feedback conversations, setting goals and working on something. Very rare, luckily. But there are those folks out there. So their
Yeah.
quality of life when they go to work, I wonder what that's like. And I feel like self-reflection is one of the answers to that problem. Like if they just thought to themselves, well, what if I just tried changing something up and made it different from the way that I did it 20 years ago? Would kids behave better? Would kids engage more consistently? And would I enjoy going to work more often? So I was just wondering, if you had any ideas on why some of those teachers might resist change or why they might not be so open to reflecting on their practice.
So I think something, like we had said, they're definitely people who can be set in their own routines and they know that it has worked in the past. So then, why would they change it? I think we ask our kids to have buy-in with their self-reflection. And I think we need to ask our teachers also to have more of a buy-in as well. And so something for me would be like, I've only been teaching now for 11 years, but I am not the same teacher that I was 11 years ago. And there's that gradual change. I trying to change maybe one thing, reflecting on, okay, I want to be more intentional on maybe parent communication, or I want to be maybe more intentional on spotlighting my student at the end of every lesson. And then communicating that back with parents because parents aren't hearing good from their kids anymore. I might even have that self-assessments. That was my one thing this year. I was being a little bit more intentional of, I think, offering some teachers a way on how to do that and sharing success stories with them would be helpful. We have these meetings where all of our PE teachers get together every Wednesday and we can share their just a general conversation is how we start out with, hey, what's working? Oh my gosh, my kids, I have been doing this. Or, hey, I have my one student and they are just getting under my nerves. How are you handling this? Because I'm about to flip my lid. And so I think, again, just that communication with the teachers.
Okay. We have a value in Denver called students first. We have several of them: integrity, accountability. Okay. Students first is one of them. And I love that value. I also wish that we had a value that was teachers first. So a lot of the work that I do is, well, number one, to retain teachers. And then number two, wanting teachers to enjoy their job. If teachers enjoy what they're doing and they feel challenged in an appropriate way, not challenged to the point where it's overwhelming and they want to give up, we're going to retain good people, right? And we're going to keep good teachers in our classroom. So when I think of self-assessment, it goes along with what you were just saying with your Wednesday meetings with PE teachers. If you're willing to reflect on your practice and continue to grow, I feel like it's going to have a positive impact on the way you view your job. And then, of course, in turn, on your quality of life. I mean, I know personally, there were lots of days when I was teaching where I felt frustrated. And I wonder if part of the answer to that was not just stewing in that frustration and trying the same thing again the next day. It was actually either reflecting on my own or having a building coach, an instructional coach, or a peer that I could reflect on that lesson with so that I could go and make changes the next day. And I think that when teachers are willing to do that, it has a positive impact on their teaching, on their students, on their mindset when they show up to work in the morning. Teacher burnout is a real thing. And I guess what my goal of this part of our conversation was to figure out if self-assessment is maybe one puzzle piece of the answer to that question.
I think it is. Absolutely. If we can't reflect as teachers, then we're asking our students to do it too. Why can't we do what we're asking them to do? We need to be good role models for them. And I think it's okay to walk into that class next week or whenever you see them and be like, I really didn't do very well. I didn't do my job as well as I should have last week. And I apologize. So I would like to go back and maybe re-show you how to do something, or can we try that again? Let's try it and work together again and be successful today. Being vulnerable for our students is going to be huge for us moving forward in that teacher reflection as well.
You really spoke to me with that. that example of transparency. I mean, that is just so totally my style. And I try to communicate that to teachers, and for some it works, and for some it's just not their style. But I've always felt that if you could be transparent with students, you're being honest with them, you're telling them that you didn't quite live up to the expectations, you're taking responsibility. I think students, almost every grade level, really values a teacher who shows that level of vulnerability and transparency and just says, hey, look, the way that our class looked yesterday isn't what I envision it looking like. And I'm going to take some ownership over that. And one thing that I'm going to do in order to correct for that is I'm going to, reiterate my expectations, or I'm going to ask us all to practice. We are a community and we're building a positive culture in this gym, and continuing on with how to show that vulnerability and be transparent with students. So I think we've got some teachers who are thinking about what it looks like to reflect on their own practice. So last question, and I know we've already talked a little bit about this. What steps might you recommend for teachers who want to self-reflect, something that is manageable and both meaningful?
Sure. I think when you had mentioned this question to me earlier, I think the first thing I said was breathe. We're human as well, and we are going to make those mistakes. And I think, like you had mentioned there, that transparency, I think if you can just own it too, like we ask our kids to own mistakes, we need to be able to do that as well. And so just breathe and just take ownership of that. I know I had a student come in the other day and she's like, Miss Evans, chill. I was like, okay, but I can't chill because I have to get this done. And I'm like, I was stressed. And this 7-year-old kid was like, Miss Evans, I wrote you a letter to just chill. Can you chill? And I was like, I can chill. Thank you for bringing me back down to earth. And so definitely to be manageable and meaningful, if you're stuck on that reflection part, just take a step back and have a look at that bigger picture. What was it that I wanted to achieve today? Was what happened out here in this class, was that what my intentions were in my meaning behind my lesson today? And asking yourself those questions, asking for help. Definitely have somebody come in and watch you. I mean, somebody somewhere has probably been where you are, frustrated with the same thing. And unless you reach out and ask someone, you're going to be kind of spiraling out this whole entire time. And so definitely my things for those teachers who are wanting to reflect, that are, needing those next few steps, just to take a big deep breath, take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and then ask yourself some meaningful questions like, what went well? What could I do better next time? And maybe, looking at my students, how did my students react in my lesson today?
Brilliant. And I think having the willingness to ask somebody for feedback, whether that be another teacher or a building leader, really is a huge part of this answer. Oftentimes there's some sort of tension between teachers and building leaders, right? And I think part of that is because building leaders mostly do evaluations without coaching that comes before them. And I think one thing that a teacher can do to be self-reflective and demonstrate that mindset is to ask an instructional coach or a building leader to come in and provide them with informal feedback. There's no stress that needs to come along with that. And the way that the teacher is demonstrating that growth mindset, I think, can only benefit them in the eyes of their building leaders. I know you have to go. It was an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Billings is lucky to have you. Thank you for making time for this conversation.
I appreciate it, Gary. You have yourself a wonderful day, and we'll be tuning in.